Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Bitz and Chitz. Today, we're going to be talking about another special topic straight from the attic realm of Erewhon. This will be a little bit familiar to listeners. We've covered Tyranno, a user on Chaos Dwarf Online. His blog is quite a special piece, so we're going to be taking a look through some of that and some other Bronze Age inspiration. Let me hand it over to Chitz, as I think this episode was largely his idea, but we're going to go through some different types of heffalumps, woozles, and other war machines that you might find coming from Bronze Age historicals.
Yeah. So look, there's a lot of chat since the old world dropped about allying in utility pieces that are not accessible to a normal Chaos Dwarf's army. And one of the things that is not accessible is, high durability, mobility, especially given some of the conversation about whether Bull Centaurs are worth it, whether Kadai are worth it, and things like that. Lots of people are looking at the line on the PDF where it says you can ally in Warriors of Chaos and getting a bit fresh. Now, it's complicated. And I'm not a big fan of obeying the rules on this kind of stuff. I'm more of a fan of talking to your friend and agreeing what army would be cool to run and then ignoring the army selection rules. However, if you are looking into it, a lot of people have been talking about Chaos Chariots and a lot of people have been talking about proxying things from the Warriors of Chaos list. And in amongst that conversation, I always find myself coming back to what we saw on Tyranno's blog back in the kind of mid-pandemic era, 2020, 2021. The blog itself is called Dwarvish Mesopotamia. Tyranno is a devoted player and quite a big figure in the Ninth Age community. So you can find him over on their forums, posting on a regular basis. He hasn't updated his blogs on CDO since 2022, but nevertheless, they remain fondly remembered in the hearts of a lot of users. And part of the reason for that is because, in exactly the spirit of Bitz and Chitz, the man is an inveterate kit basher. And so some of the things we wanted to talk to you about are very heavily inspired by him. The problems that we're trying to solve do kind of reach beyond that strict wargaming usage into the kind of Chitz and Reaver territory of, well, I made it because it's cool and I don't know what rules I would use for it, but I imagine that the one time I ever put it on a tabletop, I'll just make some special rules for it and it'll be fun, right? Like, we're talking about ideas and concepts that come from the Chaos Dwarf heritage of ancient Bronze Age and Paleolithic Mesopotamia. And all of the things that Near Eastern influence brings with it. So we'll look at chariots, but we'll also look at elephants in this episode. Before we do that, though, I think we owe a debt of gratitude, although we haven't spoken to him in 2 years, to Tyranno and his blog. Jared and I have just been reading through it and going a bit mad at some of his conversions. Just before you give me a view of what your favourite pieces are, Reaver, one thing I have to say, this is one of those blogs where reading it cost me several £100 just from ideas, just from all of the ideas and all of the ways in which he posts work in progress pictures that show how much of his stuff is just pure plastic kit bash. And he uses very little green stuff to bind some of it together. So we'll be referencing some of those things, but please, it's a 200 post blog. And if you just scroll through it, you're bound to see something you find inspiring. I know you feel the same way, Reaver. Are there any pieces that stood out to you that you wanted to mention while we're just giving credit?
Yeah, there's way too many, but there's definitely a few that stand out to me as they're something that I've worked with in the past or come very near to in other conversions, whether by happenstance or not. But I just say his bit sourcing is some of the best we've seen, and a lot of it is stuff that's near and dear to me. He used lots of Tomb King bits. He uses Dark Elf bits, which is also something that I use a lot. Dark Eldar on occasion. So that's just the sourcing here is very similar to what what I have in my collection as well. Through time, kind of realized the utility of the same pieces. But he is definitely much more rigid in terms of sticking to GW bits in large part. But yeah, it's really just impressive. But either way, a couple that I have, we'll show on screen here, are largely around the servo haulers kit. The servo haulers kit, something I've worked with. I think I've basically finished using it at this point. Either way, he's gone and made a very fun looking Iron Demon, as well as different proxies for other, like Magma Cannon equivalent, what's more like literally a howitzer, but Dreadquake equivalent, larger artillery. He's got just so much going on here in these, and I've seen tons of people use the like mid-sized servo hauler, the classic crawler tank. But I think he's one of the only people who's gone for the crane chassis with the turntable that I used in one of my ass cannon builds. So, and funnily enough, also used the howitzer kin from the same the Basilisk kit. Either way, really fun conversions. Haven't seen all of them painted, but he also just does a really good job with through in motion. Actively pouring magma into this magma thrower, doing other things, and those are all customs. So, he's not just taking crew off the street and gluing them wherever they fit. Yeah, lots of attention to detail on these, and yeah, I mean, they might not be as impressive bits wise as some of his infantry blocks, but I still think they're quite good pieces, and he really shows what you can do with kits not from the world of fantasy.
Yeah, you're not kidding. And I think one of the things I find really noteworthy about the way that he bashes is you're often, usually I would say, looking at bits from 3 or more kits. And by way of an example, right, there's a really great Hobgoblin Khan equivalent, which is a storm vermin riding a warg with a goblin head. And there's just a lot going on in a lot of these conversions that really speaks to a bit of vision applied to looking at the GW images of minis. The classic for me is his Immortals. If you just search the word Immortals on his blog, you will find them. They are painted. And these are iron breakers with masks and beards and big giant chaos shields, and then these very carefully positioned spears, which is famously a weapon that dwarfs don't tend to get given in official rules in GW world, but in reality look ultra disciplined. And I think that's one of the other things about his army, the way that he uses big shields and repeat bits really means that his big infantry blocks look incredibly disciplined, but much more stylized than an Infernal Guard block would, right? And I think that kind of sends a really clear message that's very flavorful about what these Chaos Dwarfs are about. And, you can tell these regiments march in unison, right? And, there's always green stuff work to be done, creating beards and things like that. But equally, the breadth and depth that he demonstrates you can get out of the vanilla dwarf range is something that I think we forget at our peril. Because the truth is, the majority of good, honest, simple, solid plastic dwarf torsos that are out there are order dwarfs of different kinds. And the question is, what are you going to do with them? Which I think is probably a topic for another episode, to be honest, because people are crying out for Infernal Guard conversions at the moment, and I think we kind of owe them an explanation. But yeah, look, the thing that brought us to this conversation is his famous chariot. And he actually has changed that chariot a number of times. But the most important things to understand about it is that it is designed to look and feel like a heavy Bronze Age chariot that would be ridden by proper, good, honest Bronze Age warlords in a way that is missing from the Chaos Dwarf roster, but present in lots of miniature ranges around the internet. So, given everything that's going on with people wanting to ally in Warriors of Chaos, given this project and all the different minis you could buy, we're just going to go down a list of chariots and assess them for their Bitz worthiness and decide, whether we think there's conversion potential in them and what bits you might want to salvage if that's the case. What do you reckon, Reaver? Shall we get started?
Yeah, let's go ahead and start right in with the chariots.
Okay, so the elephant in the room here is the basic Chaos Chariot, right? Which is a dual kit. You can either build it with 2 scary horses or 1 big gore beast monster with nipple horns. And the thing about the Chaos Chariot is it's kind of leaning forwards, and then it's got these generic meat men riding around in it. But it is a kit that comes with a lot of bits. And from that perspective, yeah, fine, you can use it as it is, and the Gore Beast is an interesting piece and all this kind of stuff. But really, I feel like it's not directly Chaos Dwarfy if you were to try to just swap the crew, right, for a Chaos Dwarf with a whip, which you can get from Mantic, and, I don't know, a Lord or just like a big scary warrior fella. Obviously, they would be peering over the top of it in a slightly awkward way, which is not a great look. But on the other hand, there are lots of features of the kit that I think are really important and helpful, so I definitely think it's an important place to start. Personally, I wouldn't use the Gore Beast, but it certainly is distinctive and flavorful, and it would do a job of communicating that this is a Darklands chariot. But the other thing to know about these chariots is that they are very heavy metal because they're Warriors of Chaos, right? So everything they do is heavy armor. And that starts out good for a Chaos Dwarf aesthetic, but from a practical perspective, it doesn't hugely scream Mesopotamia. What do you reckon of the Chaos Chariot, Reaver?
So I have used all of this kit except for the War Beasts and the crew. I have pretty much amassed bits of the entire rest of the kit and completely used them for everything but a chariot, right? So I will say that alone, if you needed the structure of a chariot but wanted to try and take it in a different direction with other accessories, you would end up with just a wealth of small bits and bobs for any other conversion. So that alone, I think it's a good value kit. I think even just the helms on the crew are extremely fun. That could be head swapped in any regiment and placed fairly well, I think. But yeah, you get fun chains, skulls on sticks. There's just so much that you can use here. So even if it's not really directly your chariot choice, I found a lot of fun in all the various accessories. The little fences can be fun. I think we've seen Tyranno even use different types of pieces around the structure of his war machine, like crew areas. So there's lots that you can work with here. The wheels are nice. Yeah, I don't think I would go for either of the Gore Beast or the horse option. I think you find something better there, but you could definitely do worse among GW kits, that's for sure.
Yeah, I don't like the giant horns either. No matter which version you choose, I just think they look kind of goofy.
Yeah, and you could toss those and put them in literally anything. And it's hard to go wrong with having a spare pair of horns lying around.
Stick them on the sides of the head of the Kadai destroyer that you will inevitably convert in a future episode. Indeed. But the last thing I would say, and we'll come back to this, but the one thing that I think is the best thing about this chariot, ironically enough, is the wheels. I think it has the most Chaos Dwarfy chariot wheels of any of the chariots we're going to look at in this show. And I think from that perspective, there is absolutely so many uses for that wheel that go well beyond the chariot type project, right? Those would be the wheels that I would want to put on pretty much any piece of Chaos Dwarf artillery, or anything that I wanted to become a piece of Chaos Dwarf artillery in a conversion, because they are wide and spiky and metal and industrial and big. And I think they do a lot of work in a small piece in an important way that this episode is going to have to come back to again and again, because wheels so fundamental to making a chariot look good.
Yeah, one thing I forgot to mention, the flail that one of the Lord options has that the topper on that where the chains are all connected is a really fun faceplate bit for an infantry model. It looks very bull-like, has got the elongated chaos star for like the visor if you were to go that route. Can't remember if I did that or not. I have that piece. Been waiting for something to use it on.
It's definitely as well. It's definitely a kit for the kind of Chaos Dwarf aesthetic that's going to have the 8-pointed star in it a lot. Mm-hmm. Which is not an aesthetic that I personally follow very much, because I want it to look more Hashut than Warriors of Chaos who happen to be 3 foot tall. But yeah, I think let's close the book on that chariot, because it's a pretty obvious purchase. Many people will stop there, right? Many people will get this chariot, maybe swap the crew, maybe just do nothing with it and just run it as Warriors of Chaos because they get on well with Chaos Dwarfs. There's nothing wrong with that. But the best thing about it is if you do build it with the horse variant, you get this cool gore beast that you can do whatever you want with. Let's change tack. Let's look now at something completely different. Let's look at actual chariots from the Bronze Age, and we'll start with the cheapest option. And the cheapest option is Wargames Atlantic Bronze Age chariots. Now, these have only recently come out when we're recording the episode, and they kind of demonstrate the problem. So in wargaming, we have this belief that what you do with a chariot is you charge the enemy and hit them with the horses and the chariot, and then they get crushed, and then you probably hit them with a sword, right? And unfortunately, during the era of chariot warfare, that was not how it worked at all. And the reason for that is because they were not very good at making chariots, and chariots were not particularly durable, right? And horses, by the way, in the chariot age, which were not being ridden by horseback riders at that time, were not particularly interested in fighting wars either. And so instead, what most people did, which is not cool and interesting on a wargaming table, is they rode around on the chariot, and then they jumped off, and then they probably used arrows, or they just attacked the enemy in the back, or did something more like that. It was the mobility that was valuable, not the impact. Which is why these Bronze Age chariots look shit for the purposes of a Warhammer table, right? You get 6 in a pack, no crewmen. That's pretty good, right? But they are made of, like, basket wicker. They are made of thin wood. They do not have scythes on the wheels. They do not have metal reliefs or any reinforcement or any structure of any kind of that way. And from that perspective, although they are actual Bronze Age chariots, they are probably pretty low down my list on things that I recommend that you purchase. The only time I would say that you would want to purchase them would be if you were going to make your hobgoblins or orcs and goblins be extremely Bronze Age themed, and or make them be humans or human slaves, in which case these would be great as wolf chariots, because wolf chariots are very light. But other than that, I don't really see a role for these, and I think it's important because it might feel cool initially, but actually you're going to end up with something that just kind of, looks like it's held together with sticky tape and glue.
Yeah, this one's a bit of a stretch to take across the finish line. I mean, you could, but I just don't really see why you would choose it as a starting point other than potentially quantity for cost. But yeah, you'd end up probably needing to salvage around for so many other bits that you're probably better off choosing a different starting point.
Yeah, and equally, the lightness of chariots is part of the challenge of this conversion job, right? And from that perspective, it's something you've got to bend with, as it were. But one thing that doesn't bend is resin, and that brings us to the other real Bronze Age chariot option, which is the Assyrian King's Chariot or the Babylonian King's Chariot from Warlord Games. And this one is about as blinged up as a chariot gets for that era. And it has a parasol, and it has three very worthy Mesopotamian-looking gentlemen riding around in it. And then it has some poshed up horses with bronze armor on the front. Or you could paint it as bronze. I'm not 100% sure because the images are not painted because it's quite an obscure warlord range. The one thing to commend this kit is the giant wheels, which actually look pretty useful. They're not the thickest, most Chaos Chariot-y wheels in the world, but they are significant structural items, and they do look pretty good. And the other thing that's cool about this kit is it's got a bunch of Mesopotamian royalty in the back, and they have big curly beards, and one of them's got a big hat on, and that's the king. And that has a degree of charm for it, but you would probably want to whip them off and put them in some human slave regiment, or otherwise cut them up and use their heads for bits or similar if you could extract the head and beard as a single piece. Then that brings us to the final issue with this one, which is it is prohibitively expensive. It's not sold in stores or anything like that. It's a Warlord online piece for very specific market of historical wargamers. And from that perspective, one of these will cost you more than 6 of the crewless Wargames Atlantic ones would. And that's for a piece of resin that's not particularly cooperative. So on the whole, I would still tend towards probably not this one. But I do think there's some interesting things going on with it that might be useful if you're particularly ambitious and feeling a bit flush with cash. What do you think, Reaver?
I feel like this one is something I would. Yeah, the wheels are useful. I love all of the extra bits. I would probably take them and use them in some kind of like market or something, some kind of trading market type diorama. Something like Eddie did that one time. I don't think you could regiment it. Obviously not cost effective to do so. But the Mesopotamian feel of it is very attractive, and there's certainly some fun you could have with the extra bits, even the umbrella, even just some horses. Like they look very stabled. If you wanted to go that way, they're just kind of standing there.
Yeah, I think the truth is the Assyrian king is not planning to charge into battle and get, put in any danger in this battle. Like almost all generals throughout almost all of history, he is very firmly leading from the back. And so his cool armored Assyrian horses, Bronze Age horses though they are, first of all, they'll be a lot smaller than the average Warhammer horse. And secondly, they are not dynamically posed. So, but at the same time, yeah, I almost bought this kit in a recent 15% off sale, which is ending today, I think. And I'm still kind of pissed that I didn't, but it's not the right time for me, and it's not an important piece. I'm not going to use it for anything specific. But yeah, I agree. It's just got a little bit of fun, a little bit of character to it that you kind of want to cut it up and use it in other projects, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Well, let that be its fate, and let's move on to another also ran in this particular contest, which is the Lord of the Rings Candish Charioteer. Now, Cand is one of the obscure forces of evil that GW have inevitably turned into a whole army. And their whole shtick is that they're kind of steppe warriors in a lightly armored, more sort of Mongol-esque way. They've got back banners like samurai would have and things like that. And they don't wear heavy armor in the way that the Easterlings do. The problem with the Candish Charioteer, other than size, which of course, because it's a Lord of the Rings miniature, it's sized as if it's a realistic proportioned human, is that this is probably the sparsest physical chariot that you could get. So it's got the least body to it. And from that perspective, again, I think on the whole, you probably want to sidestep it. It's also online only. It's relatively expensive for one. So it's not a bounty of bits. And from that perspective, again, it's another pass from me, but you might want to have a look at it because it is fun looking. And if you were doing Marauders of Chaos or Human Slaves, it again could be really fun and cool because the Chaos Dwarfs would probably make their human slaves ride around in something that flimsy looking, you know?
Yeah, I think that's good fate for it. Although, give a nod to his large hat. Um, but yeah, other than that, I feel like you're in human or hobgoblin territory for this.
And that brings us to back to Warhammer Fantasy. So, look, there's two important chariots left, and the reason why I'm not going to include the Stormcast chariot is because I think the Stormcast chariot, which I may have just been discontinued, I don't think it's been discontinued. Let me just check. Is because it needs too much surgery. The Sigmar style is built into the component in too deep a sense, really, for it to be worth doing, in my opinion. And so that leaves us with Dark Elves and Tomb Kings. And let's do Dark Elves first. So look, the Dark Elf Chariot is probably one of the items lowest on the list of Dark Elf things that are useful for conversion work. And Dark Elf things are extremely useful for conversion work in a lot of different situations and ways, right? Heads, swords, spears. There's a lot of stuff, motifs, embossed bits and bobs, gubbins, right? There's a lot you can get out of a Dark Elf infantry kit to help you with the Chaos Dwarf project. But the chariot's problem is that it's got a hidden wheel underneath it that makes it kind of look like it's hovering along behind. It's either being pulled by cold ones or horses, depending on what you pop for. And although it's got like nice knives and nice curved surfaces and stuff like that, really it doesn't hugely scream chariot because of that very bold design choice that they took to make it look a bit like it's hovering. And I don't think, and I've looked at this and I've thought about it in great depth, I don't think you can redeem this by just sticking some wheels on it and raising it up off the ground, because there's no natural place in the silhouette of it to put a crossbar or an axle. And so it would look pretty awkward, and you'd have to do a lot of surgery, and you'd probably have to cut off the sides, which are part of the charm of the whole thing in the first place. I don't recommend it. I don't recommend it except for a few niche uses in terms of like what the crew are wearing and holding and stuff. And even then, I just think you can do better elsewhere. So I'd probably skip this one as well. I don't know what you think, Reaver.
Yeah, I think you're going to have a more efficient purchase of Dark Elf bits if you go elsewhere. Although I am just learning where a banner that I just painted came from because I had no idea where I'd got that bit. Turns out it's right there staring me in the face, which is kind of funny. I assumed it was from a different elf range. Anyway, yeah, I mean, at this point, I would get out of this like the spears and some pointy bits, and that's great. But you can also just get that in mass in almost any other Dark Elf kit. So, yeah, pick yourself up some Blackguard Corsairs or some Dread Spears or Blackguard, and use those to hit out something else. You have a better time, I think.
And that brings us to the happy medium, the last chariot we're going to talk about today, and that is the Tomb King's chariot. And my honest view, informed, I think, by Tyranno's conversions, is that this makes probably the best chariot hull for Chaos Dwarfs to be riding around in, right? Get rid of the skeletons, get rid of the back banner, fine. But if you're going to pursue a Mesopotamian aesthetic, this has enough metal to it and enough body to it to look like it could cause impact hits. The only thing about it that I would change is the wheels, which are a bit weedy. And wouldn't you know it, we just established at the beginning of this segment that there's a really great set of wheels on the Chaos Chariot. In addition, because of the Tomb King's relaunch, these things are readily available. People picking up the Tomb King's launch box get a regiment of these chariots. And that's a cheap way of getting a copy of the rulebook for Old World as well. And so from that perspective, I think this is a very useful kit if what you're trying to do is conjure that Bronze Age aesthetic. I think Tomb King's kits in general have a lot to commend them. Tomb King's shields can be used to do lots of noteworthy things, and I think Tyranno's blog is a good example of that. But in this instance in particular, there's nothing that really says Bronze Age without having significant deficient flaws that's better than this chariot. And so I think it's probably the hull for me personally.
Yeah, so the issue that I always suffer with is I would probably just build this and use it for Tomb Kings. That's what I always run into with using Tomb King bits, unless I have true spares. Now that said, if you're not me, you could do a lot worse than purchasing any undead kit, really, because if you just need some of the structural pieces, then what are you left with? You're left with a bunch of skull bits and, scenery pieces, even dead horses if you don't mind some of the look of them. But you end up with a lot of pieces that you can use on bases or terrain or whatever. Even just having skeletons lying around is always a good thing to have. So if you're in that kind of market, I would definitely recommend any undead kit in general over an equivalent counterpart in another range. But I'd say also the front piece of the hull, the kind of curved like hemisphere, is a separate piece. There's multiple different ones you can put there, so that comes right off. So you wouldn't have to do any carving out of like relief details. That piece just comes out. The kind of side carriers for spears and bows are also separate pieces, so you'd be left with a very bare canvas, which is a great thing for this purpose, at least. So in terms of how you wouldn't see a kit constructed this way anymore. So I think you'd be lucky in that case for how easy you could work with the blank piece.
Yeah. Worth noting, 1 in 5 Chaos Dwarfs Online users has or intends to have a Tomb King's army. They are in 4th place, almost tied with Warriors of Chaos. And only behind Order Dwarfs and Greenskins in that respect. So I think you're in good company, Reaver, in terms of wanting to use them for their intended use. But they are cheap and plentiful and hard plastic once again. So from that perspective, it's no longer an eBay pipe dream. People can sign right up and get converting if that's what they choose. So that wraps it up for chariots. Really, I think there's no perfect single option for putting your Chaos Dwarfs on unless you're going with a hardcore, these guys are just mini Warriors of Chaos aesthetic. I think even the Warriors of Chaos chariot needs work. There are many options, but ultimately only a few of them are really applicable for Warhammer in my view. So from that perspective, those are the bits with Chitz.
Hey.
I hated that. That felt hideous. Let's move on to talk about big monster bases. Big monster bases. Look, someday we're going to have to do a Kadai Destroyer episode because it's one of the most fundamental questions that every Chaos Dwarf collector is going to have to answer is what's your Kadai Destroyer going to look like? And I pity the New Wave fans because although so much about Forge of the Chaos Dwarfs is so amazingly right, the one thing that they had to do was commit to an aesthetic for Kadai Destroyers that has now become the mental image that new fans have of what a Kadai Destroyer looks like. And the joy of collecting Chaos Dwarfs before Forge of the Chaos Dwarfs is that nobody had a picture in their heads. And that meant it was the single most creative thing that anyone ever embarked upon. It was, how do I want to express myself? Now, we will get onto that in a future episode. And I'm not saying that you should use war elephants as Kodai destroyers. However, elephants are big and scary, and they were used in Mesopotamian warfare for thousands of years. So, from that perspective, I feel like there's a degree of applicability here. And the good news is there are not very many of them on the market. And the main ones that are on the market are Carthaginian themed, because the main people who want to wargame with war elephants are people who are playing Hail Caesar or otherwise reenacting the Punic Wars from a historical perspective. Now, what that means is that we have 3 very realistic types of elephant and 1 fantasy elephant that I'm going to include as an almost ram. So let's start with what I think is the basic entry option for war elephants, which is Victrix Games African war elephants. And as will become a theme, you buy these in packs of 2. They are hard plastic. And because it's Victrix, it is a slightly more realistic human size and shape. It's still heroic scale, but the height is a little bit shorter than many 8th edition Warhammer plastic humans. But that's okay because they're War Machine crew. These are designed to specifically be Roman era war elephants. And from that perspective, they have a lot of realism to them. The fellas in the Howdars, they're using javelins, right? There's 4 different aesthetics that you can choose. There's lots of useful bits that you get in the kit. But fundamentally, these elephants are monstrous cavalry sized. These are not sized like a giant Warhammer monster, because that's the size that real African war elephants were back in those days. 9 feet tall at the kind of most fundamental height means they do tower over normal infantry, but on a Warhammer battlefield, all of those distances start to get a bit blurry. And so my 2 caveats for using these elephants are as follows. Number 1, they may be a little bit small and therefore be more suited to a monstrous cavalry role. And then secondly, the way that the Howdar has been designed in a very realistic way makes it quite difficult for you to put dwarfs in it, because it's too tall. And they won't be able to see out over the sights. It's not a type of Howdar that you're used to seeing in Warhammer, but it is noteworthy for that reason. And so I would advise just a little bit of caution in using these kits, because, they have a lot going for them. If you're doing human slaves, they look really good. If you want to turn the riders into hobgoblins, it's only 1 head swap away. But fundamentally, you're not going to be able to put Chaos Dwarfs on these war elephants, and that may not meet your needs. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think you hit on a lot of it. I would say I'd probably go for these as like a unit filler type option. I mean, certainly, yeah, you could go for a unit of them and find a role, but I think they'd be a fun, slave regiment unit filler option. I think they'd fit that pretty nicely. They'd seem like cute little baby elephants Warhammer wise, but I think that's fine, and it would certainly fit the role nicely. But yeah, I don't know if I'd go for them as a unit myself, but it's certainly a fun looking kit. I like the style of it. Yeah, I mean, I think you could. It depends on how they built that, how many pieces it's in, but putting in a false floor is probably doable. But in the end, what are you going to get? 1 dwarf up there? Maybe.
Yes. Yeah. There's also a width issue, I suppose, that is relevant, right?
Yeah.
I mean, to be honest, if you're one of those 2 human crew members, you know the other guy pretty fucking well, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, good luck not having awkward shuffling past each other while trying to kill people from the back of that thing. But yeah, so that's your basic entry level plastic elephants. You get 2 to a pack. They're not the cheapest in the world, but they are the cheapest war elephants. So from that perspective, you can't start lower. Let's go 1 rung up and look at the Riderless war elephants from A Song of Ice and Fire by Simon. Now, these are called Golden Company war elephants, and the position that Song of Ice and Fire appears to have taken is that war elephants are just like big animal buddies for your army who don't need any instructions. They just kind of go into battle looking, hard as nails, and they don't have any riders. So I don't know who's supposed to be controlling them, but I think in the fantasy of A Song of Ice and Fire, that's not really an issue. And look, I love these. I think they're really great, and I own a couple. They are a little bigger than the Victrix versions, so they're more kind of chariot-sized in Warhammer terms. But you could fit them on a monstrous cav base, it would just be a bit of a stretch. The only issue is they are completely riderless. But other than that, they're really nicely armored. They have like a mix of these great metal face plates, much more theatrical movie style tusks on these guys. And then they also have thick leather armor over the back that you could use. You could put a Mahout on there if you had the model that you wanted to use for it. You could put Space Marine on the back of this if you want to. But the issue is, will it look natural? And is that really what you want? Because, ultimately trying to find bits to create a Howdar is not something that I am equipped to talk about on this podcast, but it's quite difficult. If you want to try and divorce a Howdar from the monster that it's on the back of, you're going to have a bad time. So on the whole, I think these look great. And if you want a monster, these do the job really well, or a really flavorful chariot proxy, then these are nice monsters, but they lack riders, and it would be hard to convert them to have one.
Yeah, if you were to even try, you'd probably want to go the printing route. There's probably some structure out of Lost Kingdom you could scale and print out for the back. I think you'd have a hard time. Yeah, it's always a hard time making a convincing looking, purpose-built structure for the back of something curved like that. But yeah, I was just fishing through the chariots even, like maybe at a stretch you could find something in there that would fit, but I think they'd be improperly sized. At least the chances are, at least.
The more I look at war elephants, the more I think that riding one would be just like a highway ticket to death. Like, imagine how fast and hard an elephant is charging around, and you're riding in a wooden tower strapped to its back. Like, there's no way that thing's going to stay up, is there? But it must have done. So I don't know.
At least the armor is nice on these, and I feel like that would maybe make it somewhat convincing that it's well fastened to the animal, because it kind of conceals a lot. It's not just like, oh yeah, you've got one strap running around the tummy and call it a day, which is how a lot of saddles are in war games, at least. But yeah, I don't know. I think they're fun. I really don't own any Song of Ice and Fire, but this is definitely one of the more potentially appealing things you could pick up from there. It's not distinctly Game of Thrones either.
No, exactly. And I think that's the charm of some Song of Ice and Fire. But the issue is, number one, they've got naturalistic human proportions that don't look particularly good against Warhammer scale. They don't look awful, but they kind of got pinheads. And the other issue is they do not come as multi-part kits. They come as mostly single pieces in vacuum-formed, kind of classic CMON miniature covers. And you're supposed to just take them out, prime them, paint them, and play. And there's not very much conversion potential in that. And so it can be a bit of a headache trying to get invested. The other thing is a lot of their infantry comes in packs of 12, which is not very useful for Warhammer. And so from that perspective, I think the reason you don't own a lot of Song of Ice and Fire is because not very much of it would be very useful.
Yep, that's for sure.
Well, okay, let's move on to the last real elephant on this list, which is Warlord Games' Hail Caesar Successor War Elephants. Now, just like the Assyrian King's Chariot, these are expensive resin specialist models. However, they look dope as fuck, and they don't have the problems we identified in the two previous War Elephants, which is to say, Number one, they're quite large. Number two, they have howdahs intrinsic to the model, but they are wider and more useful. They have lower tops, and a little bit more floor space for you to fit a couple of guys in. So they fit 4 humans, where the Victrix one only fits 2, for instance. And then the best thing about them is that the elephants have been pimped out. They're wearing like heavy, thick bronze scale mail armor, which looks great for Chaos Dwarf usage. But they've also got like nice cloths over their heads and then armor underneath those. And they've got, much more kind of embellishments to them that make them look a bit more Warhammery. They're supposed to be Seleucid, or kind of just to be used by any Alexandrian successor state. But really, what they are is movie elephants, in the same way that Hail Caesar really focuses on what it would be like to wargame in like a swords and sandals epic from the 1950s, 60s. These are just really beautiful, large monster minis that you could do a lot with. The only thing that I would warn you against them is that they are £30 each, or thereabouts. And so buying them from Warlord directly, even if you get it on a sale and you buy them in a pair, they'll probably be about £25 each, which is not cheap. But you probably aren't going to need 10 of them. So from that perspective, if you like the way they look, they could be a really wonderful way of underlining the Bronze Age aesthetic that you're going for. I don't know what you think about these ones, Reeve.
Yeah, I mean, very cool. Especially if you're, not somebody who has a bunch of baby Romans chilling around in your loft. You could definitely find other uses for it. I think, yeah, armor, great. Obviously, something we've not seen in these selections so far. Yeah, I feel like you could work with this pretty directly. I actually kind of like the flat canvas on the front of the head. You could definitely have a good bit of fun painting that, I would think. I think you could make it Chaos Dwarfy pretty quickly. I'm assuming the detail on the shields, do they use like transfers or freehand, or is there actually any relief detail on those? I'm not really familiar.
So in my experience, it's usually transfers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Let me just very quickly see if I can get the Warlord website.
If it is that, then you absolutely have almost nothing that needs to be done to the entire Howdah, because you could just paint whatever you want on those or use your own transfers that are applicable for Warhammer. Maybe the thing you could do is, if you don't like the crest on the head, you could remove that. I feel like you could also probably work with it. You could make it spiky or something. There's definitely plenty you could do here. The Tuscan trunk armor is fantastic. I really like that detail. Yeah, I mean, yeah, you could certainly do worse than fielding one of these. I could see our Zods and Zankos of the world painting this up and it being very convincing.
Well, soon you'll have to put up with me doing it, although my goal will be to make the ultimate swords and sandals Carthaginian army. These guys could very easily find themselves pulling double duty because they're just too cool for school. Mm-hmm. Okay, and that brings us to just one last honourable mention as a Kadai Destroyer candidate that I have seen mooted many times. And this is the Lord of the Rings War Mumak of Harad. $115 for... I mean, it's like Baneblade sized, I think. Just a really fucking big, like, giant Lord of the Rings elephant. And, elephant body dysmorphia is a real issue. Like, we're making these elephants think that they need to be unrealistically huge in order to participate in fantasy battles. The War Mumak is not credible for any kind of historical use. But it is a very evocative and well-known model. And it comes with a huge amount of space on the top. So it's got 3 levels of Howdah, 4 technically, if you include the very top, that you can fit fully based infantry into and use it as a transport. Now, I'm not imagining anyone's gonna do that. But and for £70, I can see why. But it does come with its own sprue of I think they are Easterlings. I'm not sure if Harad is Easterlings, but either way, it comes with its own sprue of very Persian-looking human slaves. If you wanted to use them in that capacity, but ultimately, it's just an enormous uh, plastic monster with a regiment of 12 guys on its back. And, you know, there is no definition for what is and is not a Kadai destroyer. You couldn't use it for anything less than that because it's too big. Um, but you really could, and it would be quite arresting if you did. The only issue is it doesn't really scream Chaos Dwarf because it's all timber and fabric, which is not really the aesthetic that most Chaos Dwarfs are going for after third edition. And from that perspective, I think you might want to do some. You might want to creatively paint or fill in the gaps on some of those wooden stakes to maybe try and make them into metal. And consider giving the monster, bronze or steel tipped tusks, or even a full lava aesthetic paint job where its eyes are lava and it's got lava coursing through its veins or whatever. And that's the War Mumak, the honourable mention for today. What do you reckon, Reaver?
Yeah, so one, I do have this in its original form.
Oh, wow.
Yep. I collected a lot of Lord of the Rings SPG in its
Yes,
original
that's true.
incarnation. And did have this. I actually only recently painted it. That might have been during like peak pandemic era hobby that I actually finally just like got it out of the bin and just painted it up. It is a bear of a kit, I'll say that. There's one central seam going around the entire body, and you just be prepared for that. It's a lot of work. Also, the mold lines were just a ton of work on this because they all go like right down the center of the kneecaps, and then in contrast and usefully so, the texture is great. It's very easy to dry brush this. You can actually paint this up kind of phenomenally quickly for how utterly massive it is. But mold line cleaning is a bit of a bear because of all of that texture. You find yourself scraping through and trying not to remove all the detail of the skin wrinkles. But the head does disguise quite a bit of it since it's it doesn't have the same split down the middle, I believe. So you're in better shape there. But either way, prepared for a lot of green stuffing. The Howdah is not particularly easy either. But in general, the type of green stuff you're doing is very simple. It's just, making wrinkle texture, making, miscellaneous rope gap fill for the Howdah. So it's very doable. A little bit of canvas sculpting here and there to fill panels, but I liked it. It was fun in the end. I mean, I'm just using it out the box. I did do the obviously MVP of the Pelennor Fields battle, the Mumak with the spike strip across the tusks. I feel like you got to go that. Otherwise, you're just doing yourself a disservice. That one obviously gets the most kills. Yeah, kind of fun.
And so, in terms of storing that model, like at its full assembled size, it's a bit of a bitch, right? Like, what is it compared to?
It's as big as my Cerastus Knight. like,
Right. Okay. Yeah.
like, it's bigger than any Games Workshop plastic Imperial Knight in terms of awkwardness, for sure.
Wow. Wow. I mean, it's cheap for that at £70 GB.
Yeah, I'm actually kind of surprised at that. But yeah, especially if you're gonna like go the 9 yards and do roping and cabling, which is entirely missing from this. Between all the Howdah sections, there's actually, like, you can kind of see it on the ends of the frontmost pieces. There's actually, they kind of offer up the texture already for connection points for rope. But they just didn't obviously do that in plastics. That's not practical, but at least not at the time. So you can go a lot further to make it even more awkward to store and but yeah, so it's fun. I don't really see it fitting in fantasy battles. It even like it's bigger than destroyer sized by like a factor of 2. So it could be a fun scenario option or something like that. And yeah, you could fit a whole pair of hell cannons in that howdah if you really stretched it. Like, it's huge.
If you pay 20% off through an FLGS, you can get it for as low, and I'm looking at a listing for it right now, as £56, which for our US listeners is $70, $71. For that much plastic, it's probably one of the cheapest straight out of the box options for a Kadai destroyer we've ever considered.
It's a full sprue with 12 Herodrum plus a Lord out of the box as well, which I will say they're kind of, those are old sculpts. I had a lot of fun painting them up, but they are fundamentally fairly old. I did actually paint them up for Chaos Dwarfs, weirdly. I had a mixture of those and the Corsairs of Umbar plastics. So you can find utility in them in Chaos Dwarfs if you're willing to stretch it a bit, convert a little bit. But they are models you'll have to do some creative painting to overcome some of the issues with the sculpts.
Yeah, no kidding. They really do look Darklandsy though, so I like them for human slaves. I think that would make sense. Anyway, that's the end of my little Bronze Age warfare conversion project mental adventure. I hope it was useful to at least some of you. But even if it wasn't, then at least it was a chance to showcase some cool minis that you have seen and some cool minis that you haven't. And so that just about wraps it up for us today.
Alrighty then. Yeah, we'll close it off here. Thanks everyone for listening, and be sure to check out our other episodes and look out for some future content that we've hinted at here, including the Destroyers episode. So, and yeah, as always, if you have any recommendations, feel free to post them in our recommendations thread, and we'll see what else we can come up with. We've got, I think, quite a few things in queue at this point, so just got to get these recorded and put out on the street for all of you. So thanks for listening. Have a good one.
Bye-bye.